They spent months, maybe years, laughing behind your back, whispering to others that you were naive, fragile, and completely dependent on them to survive. They thought you were weak. They thought you wouldn't notice. Until today. Until the exact second they looked into your eyes and realized you are not the confused, compliant target they built their entire illusion around. And trust me, the panic in their eyes right now, it is a masterpiece. Think about the exact relationship where you were made to feel small, where your kindness was treated like a neon sign flashing doormat. If you've ever stayed quiet just to keep the peace, only to realize that your silence was being weaponized against your intelligence, drop a comment below and let me know you're breaking that cycle today. Because once a narcissistic personality sees that their control mechanism is fundamentally broken, everything shifts. Let's unpack this clearly and clinically, without the smoke and mirrors. Narcissistic dynamics rely on a very rigid, fragile script. In their mind, the world is divided into predators and prey, winners and losers, superior beings and absolute fools. When they first targeted you, your empathy, your willingness to see the best in them, and your patience were cataloged by their disordered mind not as beautiful human traits, but as glaring structural defects. They assumed your boundaries were suggestions. They assumed your forgiveness was an endless well of stupidity. The illusion of complacency is perhaps the most insidious trap set within toxic relational dynamics, particularly those involving narcissistic individuals. When a narcissist enters a relationship, they immediately begin a process of assessment, looking not for a partner to share life with, but for a mirror to validate their grandiosity and a vessel to absorb their emotional dysregulation. During this initial phase, an individual who possesses high empathy, genuine patience, and a mature willingness to compromise naturally offers a stark contrast to the narcissist's internal chaos. However, the disordered mind of a narcissist lacks the emotional maturity or cognitive framework to interpret these healthy prosocial traits accurately. Instead of recognizing empathy as a sign of emotional intelligence and relational strength, the narcissist catastrophically misinterprets it as a profound lack of boundaries, a deficit in intellect, and a permanent posture of weakness. This fundamental miscalculation stems from the narcissist's rigid, black-and-white worldview, which dictates that human interactions are zero-sum games where one person must dominate and the other must submit. Because the empathetic partner frequently chooses peace over conflict, absorbs minor slights to maintain harmony, and offers endless second chances, the narcissist logs these gracious choices not as virtues but as vulnerabilities to be cataloged and exploited. They mistake the partner's deliberate choice to de-escalate tension for an inability to recognize manipulation. They confuse a calm, measured demeanor with passivity, and they view a cooperative spirit as an open invitation to push boundaries further. In their skewed perception, someone who does not immediately fly into a rage, retaliate, or demand strict accountability must simply be too foolish or too dependent to notice what is happening. This misconception creates a dangerous foundation for the relationship. The narcissist builds an entire internal narrative resting on the comforting delusion that they are infinitely superior, intellectually unmatched, and permanently safe from any meaningful consequence. They assume that their partner's willingness to forgive and forget means they can rewrite history, gaslight effectively, and rewrite the rules of engagement without ever being checked. Yet, this complacency on the part of the abuser is entirely self-deceptive. The empathetic person is not stupid, nor are they weak. They are simply operating from a framework of emotional maturity that values long-term connection over petty, immediate victories. The tragedy of this dynamic is that the narcissist mistakes maturity for naivety, treating a generous heart like an unattended vault. Ultimately, this miscalculation becomes the narcissist's undoing, because beneath that apparent complacency lies a reservoir of profound strength, clarity, and self-respect that is merely waiting for the threshold of tolerance to be crossed, setting the stage for a dramatic shattering of the narcissist's fragile illusion when the truth finally comes to light. The weaponization of kindness is a foundational tactic used by toxic individuals to convert a partner's purest virtues into instruments of their own psychological subjugation. In the early stages of a relationship with a narcissist, an empathetic person naturally brings a generous spirit, offering grace, second chances, and deep understanding. These qualities stem from emotional maturity and a genuine desire to build a safe, nurturing bond. However, a disordered personality views these benevolent acts through a lens of profound cynicism and opportunism. Instead of receiving your kindness as a gift or a sign of affection, the narcissist meticulously logs your grace, your patience, and your willingness to overlook flaws not as virtues, but as glaring structural vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited for control and dominance. This dynamic unfolds systematically behind the scenes. When you choose to let a minor offense slide to maintain peace, the narcissist records it as proof that they can overstep boundaries without facing consequences. When you offer forgiveness after being mistreated, they do not interpret it as emotional strength or resilience. Instead, they register it as a lack of self-respect and an invitation to push further. Your empathy becomes a diagnostic tool for them to map out your exact tolerance levels. They learn precisely how much gaslighting, blame shifting, and mistreatment you will absorb before pushing back. Every act of understanding you extend is quietly repurposed by the abuser as a license to behave worse next time, turning your capacity for love into a direct liability. Furthermore, this weaponization relies heavily on rewriting your intentions. If you express concern or try to communicate through a conflict, the narcissist uses your past kindness against you, framing your current boundaries as sudden hostility or betrayal. They weaponize your historical patience to make you feel guilty for finally saying no, gaslighting you into believing that you are the one changing the rules. They treat your initial willingness to compromise as a permanent contractual obligation to submit to their demands indefinitely. By distorting your generous nature, they create a psychological trap where any display of standard human emotion outside of compliance is treated as a severe infraction. Ultimately, the tragedy of this manipulation is that it forces kind-hearted individuals to second-guess their own instincts. You begin to question whether your empathy is actually a weakness or whether your forgiveness makes you foolish. Yet the truth remains entirely separate from the narcissist's distortion. Your kindness was never a flaw. It was simply misspent on someone incapable of valuing genuine human connection. Recognizing this weaponization is the critical turning point where you stop feeding the cycle, reclaiming your compassion, and directing it where it is truly safe and deserved. The catalyst shift is the pivotal tectonic moment within a toxic dynamic where the entire power structure collapses because the dynamic changes fundamentally. For a long time, the relationship has followed a predictable, exhausting script. The narcissist provokes, manipulates, or crosses a line, and you react. You defend your character, you explain your intentions, you argue your point of view, or you desperately seek validation and closure from the very person who broke your heart. This cycle of reaction is precisely what the narcissist depends on. Your emotional protests, your tears, and your attempts to make them understand serve as the primary fuel that feeds their unstable ego and proves to them that they still hold total control over your emotional state. The catalyst shift occurs when you completely stop playing your assigned role in this exhausting theater. It is not born out of a desire to punish them or win an argument. Rather, it is born out of utter exhaustion and a sudden crystal-clear realization of futility. It is the exact second you decide that arguing with someone committed to misunderstanding you is a waste of your life force. You stop defending yourself against baseless accusations. You stop trying to logic your way through gaslighting. You stop attempting to squeeze empathy out of a stone. Instead of launching into an emotional defense, you meet their provocation with absolute unbothered silence or a detached neutral acknowledgement. To the narcissist, this sudden shift acts as an immediate psychological shockwave. Because they are entirely dependent on your reactions to regulate their own internal sense of reality and importance, your sudden emotional withdrawal starves them instantly. When you stop fighting back, you strip away their perceived power. They look at you and no longer see a flustered, reactive target desperate for their approval. Instead, they see an unshakable wall. This realization triggers an intense internal panic within the abuser because it signals the definitive loss of their control mechanism. They suddenly recognize that their old tricks no longer work, that their words carry no weight, and that the psychological cage they built around you has completely dissolved. This moment marks the beginning of the end of their dominance, shifting the balance of power back to where it always belonged. When a toxic individual is finally confronted with clear boundaries, undeniable competence, and profound psychological insight from a partner they previously deemed inferior, it triggers a catastrophic crisis of cognitive dissonance within their psyche. The narcissist has meticulously constructed a grandiose, fragile worldview designed entirely to protect their deep-seated insecurity and fragile self-esteem. Within this defensive architecture, they must always be the superior intellect, the master manipulator, and the ultimate judge of reality, while everyone else, especially those they target, must occupy a lower tier of awareness and capability. This delusion is what keeps their internal feelings of shame and inadequacy at bay. When you demonstrate clear insight, refuse to bite at their gaslighting, and handle complex situations with poise and sharp intellect, it directly challenges the foundational pillars of their self-image. The cognitive dissonance occurs because two mutually exclusive realities cannot occupy the same space in their mind. They believe they are infallible and omniscient, yet here is concrete, undeniable evidence that you see right through their facade, understand their pathology better than they do, and are completely unfooled by their tactics. Their brain struggles to reconcile the inferior, weak target they invented in their imagination with the sovereign, mentally sharp individual standing right in front of them. Instead of leading to a moment of healthy self-reflection or an awakening where they admire your strength, this severe cognitive dissonance usually drives them into a defensive frenzy. Accepting your true competence would mean shattering their entire ego structure and forcing them to confront the profound emptiness and insecurity they spend their lives running from. To protect themselves from this unbearable psychological collapse, they often double down on denial, projection, or aggressive distortion. They may accuse you of being the one who is delusional, cold, or manipulative, attempting to force reality back into a shape that preserves their fragile sense of superiority. Yet, regardless of how they thrash against it, the damage to their illusion is already done. Your display of competence proves that their narrative was a complete fiction all along. While they scramble internally to patch up their fractured worldview, you are left standing in absolute clarity, completely free from the spell of their distortion. This moment of cognitive dissonance marks the exact point where the power dynamic permanently flips, leaving the narcissist exposed to their own internal chaos while you step firmly into your truth. Before we look at the exact psychological shockwaves they experience when the mask slips and they see your true strength, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You need these frameworks if you are going to navigate toxic dynamics without losing your sanity. When a narcissist finally realizes that you are not the weak, compliant person they originally manufactured in their mind, it does not lead to a graceful exit or an admission of defeat. Instead, it triggers a volatile escalation phase characterized by frantic, desperate attempts to reestablish dominance. For the narcissist, losing control over their primary source of emotional regulation and validation is a psychological emergency. They cannot tolerate a reality where their target sees through them, holds firm boundaries, and remains unbothered by their tactics. Because their fragile ego cannot handle being outmatched or abandoned, the dynamic shifts rapidly from covert, subtle manipulation to overt, high-intensity retaliation designed to break your resolve and force you back into submission. This escalation often manifests in several unpredictable ways depending on what weapon they think will be most effective. If their subtle gaslighting and guilt-tripping no longer work, they may pivot to aggressive rage, attempting to intimidate you into a defensive reaction. When that fails because you maintain your emotional detachment, they may seamlessly shift into a sudden theatrical love-bombing phase, offering fake apologies, grand promises, and intense affection designed to catch you off guard and lure you back into the familiar trap. They test every angle, searching for any remaining crack in your armor where they can wedge their manipulation back in. When they realize that even affection and faux remorse bounce off your new boundaries, the desperation deepens into malicious territory, frequently resulting in a full-scale smear campaign. The narcissist will rush to control the narrative among mutual friends, family members, or colleagues, painting themselves as the victim of your sudden cruelty or instability. This is not just an attempt to punish you, it is a defensive reflex to secure external validation and supply from others before you have a chance to expose who they truly are. They must rewrite the story to convince themselves and anyone who will listen that you are the problem because facing the truth of their own failure is entirely impossible for them. Navigating this escalation phase requires immense mental fortitude because it is designed precisely to test whether your newfound strength is real or temporary. The narcissist is throwing everything they have at the wall, hoping something will stick and drag you back down into the emotional mud. However, understanding that this chaos is just a desperate tantrum changes everything. When you recognize that their escalation is actually a measure of their defeat, you stop reacting to the noise. You see the smear campaigns, the frantic hoovering, and the theatrical outbursts for what they truly are. The final flailing gasps of a control mechanism that has completely broken down, leaving you safe, steady, and entirely free from their grasp. Radical detachment acts as the ultimate antidote to toxic dynamics because emotional indifference is fundamentally lethal to a narcissist. To understand why this state of being is so powerful, you have to look at how a narcissist operates on an energetic level. They do not experience genuine emotional connection or self-sustaining self-worth. Instead, they rely entirely on external validation, drama, and emotional reactions from others to regulate their inner instability. Whether your responses are filled with love, Tears, anger, frustration, or defense, you are feeding them. Every emotional outburst you give them serves as psychological fuel, proving to their disordered mind that they hold absolute sway over your existence and that they matter enough to move you. When you practice radical detachment, you completely shut off that supply line. You stop fighting back, you stop trying to make them see your side, and you stop reacting to their provocations with anger or distress. Instead, you cultivate an internal state of absolute neutrality. To the narcissist, this lack of reaction is not just frustrating, it is terrifying. When they push your buttons and nothing happens, when they throw a tantrum and are met with a calm, unbothered stare, they are forced to look into the mirror of their own emptiness. Your emotional unavailability starves them of the very oxygen they require to maintain their grandiosity. This starvation creates an immediate internal crisis for the abuser. Without your emotional reactions to anchor their chaotic reality, they begin to unravel. They may try escalating their behavior, turning up the volume, or manufacturing crises to force a response out of you, desperate to get a rise that proves they still have a pulse in your world. However, by holding the line of radical detachment, you deny them that satisfaction. You teach them through your unwavering stillness that they no longer have access to your peace. Ultimately, radical detachment is not about punishing the narcissist. It is about reclaiming your sovereignty. It requires you to redirect all that wasted energy, pain, and focus back onto yourself. By refusing to engage with their toxic theater, you shift from being a reactive participant to an unbothered observer. You realize that their chaos cannot touch you unless you open the door and let it in. In this space of profound emotional independence, the narcissist loses all leverage, and you find the absolute freedom that comes from knowing their opinion, their drama, and their manipulation no longer hold any power over your life. Stepping into observer mode represents a profound psychological transformation that changes the entire dynamic between you and a toxic individual. For a long time, you were deeply embedded in the chaotic theater of the relationship, playing an active, reactive role where every push from the narcissist was met with an immediate pull from you. You were caught in the crossfire of their emotional dysregulation, taking their projections personally, absorbing their misplaced shame, and fighting desperately to prove your innocence or worth. Observer mode shatters this cycle by pulling you out of the emotional arena and placing you safely in the stands. It allows you to step back mentally and watch the manipulation loops unfold with clinical detachment, as if you are studying a behavioral science experiment rather than living through your own trauma. In this mode of heightened awareness, the illusion completely falls apart because you stop identifying with the narratives the narcissist projects onto you. When they throw a tantrum, resort to gaslighting, or try to twist reality, you no longer feel the burning urge to defend yourself or correct their distortions. Instead, you see the behavior for what it truly is: a predictable, repetitive script driven by deep-seated insecurity and a disordered need for control. You notice the exact patterns, the tired manipulation tactics, and the frantic attempts to elicit a reaction. This shift transforms your internal state from one of anxious distress to one of quiet, unshakable clarity. You are no longer a vulnerable target reacting out of fear or confusion. You are an objective witness watching a hollow performance. This transition is profoundly empowering because it restores your sense of agency. When you operate as an observer, you realize that you do not need to absorb their chaos, nor do you need their validation to know your own truth. The narcissist's power entirely depends on your active participation in their drama. The moment you sit back and watch them without reacting, their power evaporates. They are left performing to an empty room, shouting into a void because the energetic cord connecting you to their dysfunction has been cleanly severed. By maintaining this posture of objective observation, you protect your energy, preserve your mental peace, and reclaim the emotional sovereignty that was stolen from you. True healing begins the moment you realize that a narcissist's past miscalculation of your worth was entirely a reflection of their own internal limitations, never a measurement of your value. When you have spent years internalizing someone else's toxic projections, it is easy to fall into the trap of believing that their distorted version of you is real. You start to question your intelligence, your strength, and your judgment because an abusive person conditioned you to do so. However, reclaiming internal authority means stripping away their voice from your mind and recognizing that their inability to see your worth stemmed from their emotional blindness, not your deficits. A disordered individual is fundamentally incapable of perceiving authentic strength, deep empathy, or true emotional intelligence, because those concepts exist entirely outside their narrow, manipulative worldview. To them, anyone who shows patience is simply a fool, and anyone who offers grace is merely a servant to be used. When they labeled you as weak or stupid, they were simply projecting their own deep-seated fears of vulnerability and inadequacy onto you. They needed to believe you were inferior to justify their mistreatment and to protect their fragile, inflated ego from the terrifying reality that you were actually far stronger and more evolved than they could ever hope to be. Stepping into your internal authority means rewriting this narrative from the ground up. It requires you to look back at the relationship not as proof of your naivety, but as a masterclass in resilience. You realize that your willingness to forgive, your desire to make things work, and your deep capacity for love were never weaknesses. They were extraordinary strengths that you mistakenly handed to someone who had no idea what to do with them. Reclaiming your power means forgiving yourself for staying too long, for trying too hard, and for believing promises that were never meant to be kept. Ultimately, this realization cuts the final cord tying you to the abuser's reality. You no longer need their approval, their apology, or their validation to know who you are. Your worth is no longer subject to the approval of someone whose entire existence is built on a foundation of smoke and mirrors. By reclaiming your internal authority, you step out of their shadow and into an unshakable sense of self-respect. You realize that the greatest victory over a toxic dynamic is not making them understand how much they hurt you, but realizing that their opinion never actually mattered in the first place, leaving you completely free to live, heal, and thrive on your own terms. The ultimate realization a narcissist faces is not just that you are strong, but that you were never the broken, compliant creature they manufactured in their mind to begin with. Every manipulation tactic, every attempt at gaslighting, and every effort to diminish your intellect ultimately collapses against the solid wall of your unshakable self-awareness. When you replace emotional reactivity with radical detachment, step back into observer mode, and reclaim your internal authority, the entire toxic dynamic shatters. You realize that their miscalculation of your worth was always about their profound limitations, never your value. And in that moment of absolute clarity, the game is over, the illusion is broken, and you walk away completely free.